great honor of, of being able to introduce our keynote speaker today. So I'm going to launch into doing just that. This year's Distinguished Wolff Lecturer is Professor Jason Camlot, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. His scholarly expertise is stunningly broad, encompassing literature and sound studies, Victorian literature and culture, 19th century print culture and rhetoric, media history, sound recording, elocution and recitation, contemporary American and Canadian poetry, poetry as a genre, romantic literature, and literary archives. And in addition, he is a poet with 4 published collections to date. Indeed, as far as I know, he is the only Wolff lecturer to be a practicing poet, as well as scholar of print, acoustic, and digital studies. His many honors and awards include multiple grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the 2015 Donald Gray Prize for the best article in Victorian Studies for his article, Historicist Audio Forensics, the Archive of Voices as Repository of Material and Conceptual Artifacts, the Prix l'Académie de la Vie Littéraire for his poetry collection, What the World Said, in 2014, and being named a finalist for the Award for Excellence in Recorded Sound Research for his 2019 monograph, Phonopoetics, The Making of Early Literary Recordings. He's more recently expanded his investigations of Victorian literature and sound recordings in Hearing Trilby, a phonographic reading of sonic nostalgia, in a 2022 issue of Victorian Review, and media affordances of literary audio in the 2024 Edinburgh Companion to Contemporary Sound Studies. His 2008 monograph, Style and the 19th Century British Critic, is a major contribution to periodical studies, as well as stylistics and rhetoric. Indeed, in his introduction, he asserts that these 2 fields, rhetoric on one hand and periodicals on the other, cannot be separated if they are to be understood properly. This deeply researched book across the whole of the 19th century, from the early days of the Noctambrosiani and Blackwood's magazine to J.S. Mill's monthly repository essays, on to the magazine essays on style by Ruskin, Arnold, Pater, and Wilde at Century's End. His discussion of numerous other periodical contributors further enriches this work. Its larger project is investigating the problematic of communication that was authentic and sincere and efficacious in a new era of magazine culture, which had a bearing on authorship and readers' pragmatic and romantic conceptions of rhetoric, conceptions of poetry, models of the critic and criticism at mid-century, and style in the individual in an era of mass print at century's end. He's recently revisited his work on Victorian essays and criticism, which is both the topic and his title, with expanded interest in roles of perception, listening, and national identity in his book chapter in the Cambridge History of the British Essay in 2024. His 2019 book, Phonopoetics, a history of media study admirably suited to our conference theme of voices and visions, investigates sound recordings of poetry performance and their professional and pedagogical functions, and gives, for instance, extended attention to recordings of Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, which first took form as a periodical poem in the 9 December 1854 Examiner. An important link between Professor Camlot's 2008 and 2019 books, I suggest, is their shared probing of technology-enabled media, and more particularly, the issues of sincerity and the impact of belletristic rhetoric, including elocution and criticism. His poetry, too, often gestures towards matters Victorian, as in his poem Queen Victoria, from his collection Vlarf, published in 2021. And with his indulgence and yours, I'm going to read that poem to you. Queen Victoria, your tobacco forms a German pink prince in me. Queen Victoria, all your cold, dirty, empty ornaments are gone. Queen Victoria, your lace Bibles drown in mechanical, musty bidets. Queen Victoria, you nursed me upon sorrow perfect memorials. Queen Victoria, your century giants have tested every heavy, star-dazed loss. But it's time to hear from Professor Camlot directly in his essay, in his lecture entitled The Figure of Voice in Victorian Periodicals of Speech and Elocution. Please help me welcome him.
Wow. Thank you so much, Linda. It's an honor to be introduced by you, honestly. And it's an honor to be here. I want to thank Preeti, Allison, Troy, April, Mary, Carrie, the entire board. It really is an honor to be delivering this particular lecture. I've been asked over the last couple of days more than ever at a conference, is this your first RSVP conference? It seems like a refrain. And I take it as a kind of the spirit of RSVP to welcome people, to know, like, are you new here? I haven't seen you lately. In fact, my first RSVP conference was the conference that was held at Yale in 1999. It was an epic conference, the Snowstorm Conference, where when Laurel Brake rented a car and drove against all odds to make it in time to deliver her talk. I also was at the 2018 conference where I delivered a workshop on scrapbooks, and Brian Maidment was delivering a workshop on prints, and that was one of the best workshops I ever attended. Not mine, his. VPR was also the venue of my first refereed publication when I was a graduate student. I still remember receiving the reader's notes in my submission, typed on onion skin paper. And the paper had been cut just after the text. So it was like someone who really, valued paper and wasn't going to waste the whole sheet on something that didn't require it. So I was impressed, I was a longtime contributor to the RSVP bibliography. And also some of you may remember when Michael Wolff retired, he began to sell off some of his own collection of periodicals. And I was one of those RSVP members who indulged in purchasing some. So I'm going to start with that. So they sit in my library. I still use them in teaching. And, they're there as much because they're from his library as for any other reason, I guess. Okay. So throughout this amazing conference, we've heard examples, and I have to say that was a beautiful reading performance of an okay poem, but I think you really lifted it up. So we've heard examples of how voice and voices have been heard, displayed, silenced, and erased in Victorian periodicals throughout the 19th century. A favorite non-elocutionary example of the manifestation of voice in Victorian periodicals has, for me, and Linda mentioned it, always been found in the imaginary colloquies published as the Nocte Ambrosianae, a series in Blackwood's that ran from 1822 to 1835. These often rowdy dialogues of literary gossip and criticism, delivered in the distinctive characterological voices of the column's recurrent revelers. So Christopher North, the editor John Wilson, the Ettrick Shepherd, Timothy Tickler, English Opium Eater, I don't have to list them off, and many numerous special guests communicate through generic and dialectical diversity the polyvocality that made certain of the early Victorian periodicals so exciting, so messy, so noisy. The Noct and Blackwood's, in a broader sense, was a space that aimed to situate speakers within a corporealizing material and discursive context, and to test an argument's footing, to use a phrase from Irving Goffman, by sounding it out, by transposing texts, often from one generic or discursive form or register into another, and by experimenting with informal fusions of generic and discursive modes and tones, very often to comic effect or to critical effect. Say, by transposing a letter from Byron to the editor of a rival periodical into a poem of double ottava rima stanzas in Byronic style. Wilson was amazing at generic transposition, rewriting something into another genre. Or by introducing a course of lectures on poetry by a nitpicky lawyer. This last example was a running series attributed to advocate Charles Neves and signed Legelgius Lector, quibbling or legalistic reader. Such practices of discursive transposition, permutations that exchange some element of a recognizable discourse, but keep others fixed, worked to reveal the very material and positional import of syntax and diction, and by extension of language, speech, and their fixity in voice, upon many generic and disciplinary delineations that were in the process of becoming professionalized and compartmentalized during the first half of the 19th century. This facility and pleasure in revealing the seams that bound discursive registers into their right way of sounding indicates a confidence in periodical readers to recognize and parse how specific kinds of voices were supposed to sound, to laugh when they were misapplied, yes, but to know that they were misapplied. Blackwood's, in the way I'm framing it, is a strong manifestation of the periodical as a site of entrainment in voice and listening. Perhaps it manifests the emergence of an audile technique, an approach to listening that aims to restrict the sound of the human voice to a very narrow figure, as it is associated with some conception of identity, professional identity, regional or national identity, class identity, etc. The vast sea of periodical literature throughout the Victorian period can be read along these lines, of course, as a space of entrainment in listening to voice and in formulating figures of voice. So let me begin to explain what I mean by these terms, entrainment and the figure of voice. As Amanda Weidman has noted in defining voice, quote, the sound produced by the vocal organs, considered as a general fact, phenomenon, is secondary in importance to a meaning that fuses a basic, literal sense to the notion of voice as an index or signal of identity. Almost before we can speak of the sound itself, we attribute the voice to someone or something. So an appropriate place to start in considering voice as a concept is the distinction between sound and signal, or sound and voice, as the signal we're discussing today. I've parsed the distinction between sound and signal at some length in Phonopoetics, but two key observations from that extended historical account can be summarized here. The first point observes that the moment of transduction from vibrational and auditory entity into representation marks the movement of sound into signal. The second point is that once sound moves into the realm of signal, once it moves into representation, it becomes subject to conceptual speculation, description, interpretation, metaphorization, manipulation, curation, and myriad forms of affective engagement, including feelings of discomfort, caring, ambivalence, and judgment. The complexity of a signal is manifest in its status as an entity open to interpretation and thus subject to presuppositions, approaches to listening, and cultural frames, among other interesting mitigating factors. While we may not be able to trace the presuppositions that inform our reception of a particular signals, as we sometimes can the sound, if we hear a knock, we can usually find the source of that, not always, to some original source, We may become aware of the instances of entrainment that allow it to persist as a figure of sound. Oh, sorry, I gotta find the arrows here. The figure of sound is a concept Nina Sun-Eidsham uses to describe a listener's constellation of beliefs in their knowledge of a signal as a stable, knowable sound. The figure of sound framework Eidsham uses in The Race of Sound to describe the situation that instantiates common presuppositions about race, informing the perception of vocal timbre, offers one scenario in which the qualities of a sound, vocal timbre, and its meaning as a signal, quote, seem to conform to one another so closely, there is no analytical space within which to assert a third point, the role of the interpretant, close quote. This frames the figure of sound, a hyper presuppositional and normalizing way of naming a sound as a naturalized entity, as a restrictive paradigm of sonic and figurative perception. This paradigm effectively confuses or collapses the categories of sound and signal and elides the fact that multiple naming possibilities nonetheless exist in attributing representational meaning to a sound as a signal. Technically speaking, like in physics, entrainment is the perfect synchronization of one oscillating entity with another or with others with which it interacts. By focusing on entrainment as a phenomenon in which the naturalized meaning of a signal can be nudged out of sync, revealed, contested, and transformed through the creation of a role for the interpretant of the signal, Eidsham helps us think about the power structures and micropolitics at work in how we perceive, feel, understand, and act on sonic information, how we figure it, what we do with it. Elocution periodicals of the late 19th century, and I'll be focusing on just a few American ones. I should say this is totally new work, and I spent the last 2 months just diving into a bunch of stuff. So I'm kind of doing a show and tell as well, with some initial formulations around them. So elocutionary periodicals, these American ones, represent a space in which the entrainment of voice with its purpose and expression was the explicit concern. In these periodicals of vocal culture, the figure of voice came to be defined in very specific ways for the purpose of literary study, which will be my focus, among many other fields of theory and practice. These periodicals offer a view of how the reading and speaking voice stood at the intersection between amateur and professional practice, between community and institutional organizations, between mere entertainment and true art, between the false and the true, really between a lot of things. The periodical, in this instance, becomes the discursive repository of philosophies and methods that would find or lose authority through the formation of humanities disciplines within institutions and departments of research and study. The debt of what came to be known as the new criticism and the method of close reading that continues to garner so much critical attention, perhaps even more than ever over the past few years, with two new books by John Guillory, books by Jonathan Kramnik, Michael Clune, and many others on the subject. So the relationship of the new criticism to the new elocution of the late 19th century is increasingly well documented. I will add to this evidence today by reflecting on how elocutionary periodicals organized speech and reading for literary interpretation. And I will begin to formulate an account of what the figure of voice for literature was supposed to sound like during this interesting episode of literary and cultural history. So what kinds of periodicals of speech and elocution were circulating in the 19th century and in the late 19th century in particular? So I've only begun to make my way through this material, so I can't promise a comprehensive answer to the question, but I have read, examined, and collected a little bit, enough of them to provide a preliminary overview. So a kind of an initial anatomy of late 19th century elocutionary periodicals, and to make some general observations about them and their importance for the formulation and espousal of methods for literary entrainment and education. In scanning this, sorry, I'll go back. In scanning this selection of specimens, I can observe a few things about the field of elocutionary periodicals in America from the 1870s on. These journals range from periodical anthologies of literary selections for the purpose of recitation, with little commentary on the methods of practice in speaking those texts, to B, instruments of very particular ideas and theories of elocution espoused by an individual or a small group of like-minded experts and teachers of a particular quote-unquote school, meaning philosophy, or method of voice practice, to C, instruments of actual bricks and mortar schools of speech and oratory, to D, more encompassing vehicles that combine these specific functions under one periodical cover. So, for example, Scrapbook Recitations was a monthly anthology to which one could subscribe to receive choice selections for recitation and performance. Standard Comic Recitations is another example of this kind of periodical publication, but obviously with a generic twist to it, funny ones. And there were many other such publications circulating in the 19th century. As the inner cover of Scrapbook Recitations #4 states, it was a miscellaneous collection of prose and poetry for recitation and reading designed for schools, home, and literary circles and all kinds of entertainments. While it was a source book without a philosophy of performance endorsed in a preface or afterword, it was edited by H.M. Henry Marlin Soper, 1850 to 1911, who, as the cover states, for several years past served as professor of elocution and oratory in prominent schools of Chicago. Chicago comes back a lot in this talk, and was now located at the Chicago Athenaeum. Soper never published a book of elocutionary theory or method of his own, but he reviewed the works of elocutionary theorists at association conferences and in the pages of elocutionary journals. And like so many other elocutionists of the period, he offered courses under his name, even as he taught oratory through educational institutions. Most every elocutionist was the president of some school at some point in their career. You can see the index to the selections of prose and poetry provided in this number, as well as Soper's brief preface, which indicates that the previous numbers sold well, and most importantly, informs us how the selections of these kinds of works circulated in print. As you examine recitation and elocution anthologies and manuals in bulk, you come to see that many of the same selections made the rounds. So a practical canon of selections for elocutionary performance was being formulated through the publication, circulation, repurposing, recirculation, and use of these periodical publications. You may be surprised in examining this table of contents not to find some of the more expected canonical literary recitation pieces in this number. There's no Poe, no Tennyson, no Browning, authors who would indeed become key figures for the elocutionary canon. Instead, we have selections attributed to less well-known authors. I'm curious to know if anyone has heard of W.W. Fink or F.N. Zabriskie. Maybe it's possible. And also to other periodicals, newspaper and magazines. Sources, the Brooklyn Eagle, Detroit Free Press, Mobile Register, Harper's Magazine, New York Independent. As Soper indicates in his preface, an important element of this process of recirculation was the participation of the community of readers and reciters who subscribed to such periodicals in sharing and furnishing the publications with pieces they had discovered elsewhere and tested in practice themselves. The scrapbook metaphor of this print publication's title was also very literal, as recitation pieces were cut out from printed sources and collected in individuals' homemade recitation scrapbooks, which then made their way back into print, again, through periodicals like Soper's. The circulatory movement between scrapbook and print highlighted the capacity of taste and selection for reading as a virtue, and also gave shape to the more abstract cultural relations of amateur to professional, home to school, entertainment to art. Soper's little prefatory note to an anthology otherwise devoid of commentary or instruction reveals a key function of the elocutionary periodical: to foster and educate communities of readers involved in the practice of reading texts out loud, to entrain them in a shared sense of what the figure of voice should be in reading literature. Instruction for how readings should be performed were made available through other books and periodicals. The periodical form was useful for the cultivation of such communities of practice because they secured some form of commitment through subscription and afforded the persuasive impact of periodical repetition, like timely drilling in practice, another meaning of the word entrainment. Repetition was a key affordance for practical philosophies that required significant and repeated explanation, and that were seeking authority as the best of all methods to use. On the continuum between selections, anthologies like Soper's scrapbook recitations, and periodicals that expounded full-fledged elocutionary philosophies and methods, were the selections-oriented periodicals that also included short articles of advice on how to go about reading and performing the selections provided. For example, the Elocutionist Journal, this ran in New York just for a short period, 1877, 1878, but we'll see why. Was quarterly, that occasionally opened with a single short unsigned article on some practical concern, and pretty generic ones like how to make up for the stage or style, followed by about 15 three-columned pages of selections and a few final pages of advertisements. Some issues had no articles of advice at all, just column after column of selections to choose from. And this brings us to the second kind of elocutionary periodicals I listed, those that served as instruments of very particular ideas and theories of elocution, espoused by an individual or small group of like-minded experts and teachers of a particular school, philosophy, or method of voice practice. Chicago. The elocutionist, devoted to the science and art of elocution, action, utterance, and the power of speech, and choice selections for readings, recitations, and declamation, represents one step further along this continuum. In addition to selections, each monthly number included at least one paper by its editor, Henry, Professor H.M. Dixon, on an aspect of, quote, the science and art of elocution. So articulation, pronunciation, etc. As Dixon explains in the introductory note to the July 1881 number, these papers will contain valuable suggestions both to the amateur and professional, and alone will be worth many times the price of subscription. And he goes on to double down on that claim. Dixon then self-published the first year's run of the Elocutionist with a preface and index to the articles and selections as an elocution textbook, and continue to expand on the instruction apparatus in further editions of that assemblage of what was, in effect, a periodical in textbook form. He thus used the periodical as a means of producing, quote, a course of lessons in elocution and how to teach them, close quote, which was the title he gave to the introductory essay to the third edition of the book version of the Elocutionist published in 1884. This example reveals an ideal that lay behind many elocution periodicals, which was to realize a coherent method of reading that would gain authority through widespread use in educational institutions. This fantasy of pedagogical ascendancy is manifest in the subscription courses that many of these periodicals offered. So I don't have time, nor have I done the research really to rehearse the history of correspondence course programs here, although they're obviously relevant to think about in this context. It will be enough to mention that while William Pittman had already developed correspondence courses in Britain in the 1840s for courses in shorthand, elocutionary periodicals played an important role in this history in the United States, with the foundation of the Chautauqua Correspondence College in 1881, and its authorization to grant degrees a few years later, and with a similar program funded right here in the city at the University of Chicago by its inaugural president, William Rainey Harper, in the early 1890s. Elocution periodicals like Shaftesbury Magazine of Oratory, the Chautauquan magazine I mentioned, Werner's Voice magazine, I'll return to that one at greater length later, organized their services to subscribers through a number of evolving departments based on forms of speech, like recitations, lecture recital, debate, and physical culture that were presented as distinct areas of study that you would subscribe to. Shaftesbury magazine introduced and outlined a running series of articles and exercises illustrating the Ralston system of physical culture, which is a system of the editor's own invention, to run in each number of the journal for 4 years. So talk about a strategy for locking down your long-term subscriptions, right? This course, the notice states, will be a complete system of hygienic exercises in physical culture for home practice and school drill. There's actually a really sinister side to Shaftesbury's and the editor of that journal that I won't get into. I kind of left it out of this talk, but I'm happy, the hygienic side and the idea of it being possible only for certain races to achieve the kind of physical culture that he was aiming at became increasingly a theme in that journal. Werner's magazine study club in 1897 with courses, meaning a running series of articles across numbers on such topics as the fine art of poetry, authors of the 19th century, and other feature departments emerging as new slot courses, as new slot courses might arise in the department curriculum, edited by specialists under contract. For example, one by Livingston Russell on actors and acting, and another by Geneviève Stebbins on Delsarte expression. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to provide a gloss digression on Delsartism, just in case you're not familiar with it. François Delsarte was a French singer, orator, and teacher of oratory whose lessons about achieving aesthetic correspondences between mind, body, and soul through universal poses and postures and gestures. His teachings were developed into an American Delsarte system of postural and expressive rules and principles by Steele MacKay and Stebbins, who I just mentioned. The American system was often critiqued as mechanical and rigid. Carrie Preston's book, Modernism's Mythic Pose, is a good place to start if you're interested in the legacy of Delsartism in dance and silent film and other media. Expression, a quarterly journal of art, literature, and spoken word, was a vehicle for the approach to literary interpretation developed by Samuel Silas Curry, who lived 1847 to 1921, who was an outspoken rival of Stebbins and a critic of American Delsartism. And I will say the accounts of some of the association conferences from later issues about the battles between these different schools are really intense and fun to read. Okay, so it was published by an actual bricks and mortar school, the School of Expression, later renamed Curry College in Curry's honor, that he directed from 1888 until his death in 1921, and it still exists. It's a liberal arts college now. Other periodicals in this vein were Emerson College Magazine, an instrument of Emerson College School of Oratory, and Action and Utterance, a review of elocution, oratory, physical culture, and pantomime, published quarterly by the New York School of Expression, which was founded by Stebbins. So I don't expect you to have heard of S.S. Curry, unless maybe you're a Browning scholar, because then you might have heard of him, or anyone whose name I've just mentioned so far. But Curry was an influential figure during a period when modern schools of speech and expression were developing in the United States. He published numerous works on vocal expression and the oral interpretation of literature. His theories were positioned in his time as representative of a naturalist as opposed to mechanical or highly prescriptive elocutionary school that was associated with Delsarte. He was part of a new psychological approach to oral literary interpretation that he shared with other new elocutionists, such as Charles Wesley Emerson, who I mentioned, Solomon Henry Clark, who was professor of public speaking at the University of Chicago, Hiram Corson, professor of rhetoric and oratory at Cornell, Ian Kirby, and others whom you've likely never heard of and may never again, except for when I return to a couple of them in a few minutes. An example of the curriculum Curry designed can be found in this May 1896 issue of Expression. Taught in a sequence of 3 courses, it moves from technical vocal training to training in dramatic expression and literature. So that's kind of like literary interpretation. And you should note that the ultimate training texts in course number 3 are the Bible and Browning. And you'll see that Curry wrote books on both. In his published books with titles like The Province of Expression, 1891, Imagination and the Dramatic Instinct, 1896, Vocal and Literary Interpretation of the Bible, 1903, and Browning and the Dramatic Monologue, 1908, Curry stressed the role of the individual interpreter's use of imagination, what he called dramatic instinct, a creative outward realization of the interactivity and action of the text, as opposed to the mapping of predetermined elocutionary protocols on the reader's performance of a text. As Guillory points out in Professing Criticism, in the 100 years prior to 1950, literary study was defined as the work of philology, rhetoric, belles lettres, and history, literary history. Curry's method of literary expression or oral interpretation does not represent necessarily an eschewal of historical, philosophical, philological, or rhetorical methods of literary study for something exclusively spiritual or aesthetic, but rather integrates or assimilates, to use Curry's terminology, what have been described by historians of the discipline as competing scholarly methods into a synthetic, embodied, experiential, and personalized form of literary interpretation based on a reader's imaginative and sympathetic realization of the speaker as situated in the text. The published numbers of expressions sketch out Curry's formulation of a full-fledged elocutionary theory and method through short essays on a wide range of subjects concerning literature, art, and expression. In the early numbers, they were all authored by Curry himself. And then, as the school's faculty and activities expanded, expression came to be include longer accounts of their summer schools, proceedings of their annual conference, and discussions held there, and articles contributed by faculty taught at the schools and the summer schools. As a platform for articulating the purpose and methods of teaching expression, it also, by necessity, offered surveys of the field and commentary on what arts and literary education should look like. For example, in his essay, Departments of English in the Colleges, Curry asks, what are the real objects of studying English? And he answers, it is by the student's use of English that the teacher can most directly test the action of the student's mind, the harmony of his faculties, his culture, and his ability to use his knowledge. In advocating for a synthetic pedagogy, Curry critiqued the dominant divisions for studying literature at the time, philological study, historical, and rhetorical belles lettres, because they distorted the overarching purpose of literary study. Considering philological studies, for example, he lamented the reduction of the masterpieces to mere objects of philological analysis. And he goes on in this article to insist that, quote, the practical development of power in vocal expression and speaking is necessary in literary study for students to develop a true appreciation of literature and to have any truthful feelings. So the very capacity to feel truthfully, truly, was at stake. The last periodical I'm going to look at, Werner's magazine, which is a massive example that I'm just scratching the surface of, was a kind of omnibus manifestation of the elocutionary periodical, in that it seems to have encompassed all the goals, formats, and departments that were deployed more selectively by periodicals with more specific purposes under one cover. In January 1879, Edgar S. Werner, who lived from 1850 to 1919, the entrepreneurial director of a school for stutterers, published the first number of The Voice, also later called Werner's Voice magazine and then just Werner's magazine. It operated out of Albany, New York initially from September 1879 and lasted all the way until 1902. It also ended up in Chicago, but it died after one issue that it put out here. According to Francine Merritt's analysis of periodicals directories, Merritt wrote a very useful dissertation on Werner's in 1953. The circulation ranged from 3,000 in its first years, from 1879 to 1885, to between 6,000 to 8,000 subscribers in the mid-1880s to the early 1890s, and then saw shrinking circulation from around 2,500 to about 1,000 in its final years. Much like Harper's Magazine at the time, in its early numbers, it functioned as a kind of digest, reprinting articles and excerpts from books and journals, especially foreign materials, either from England or in translation from Germany and France. In its earliest years, the journal was identified as a monthly devoted to voice culture with special attention to stuttering and stammering. Werner, who stuttered from childhood, devoted much of his life to collecting information about treatments for stutterers. By the time he founded The Voice, he had collected a large body of material and had developed a wide international network of experts in this area. The journal thus began as a way for him to share the materials that he'd been collecting, kind of backlog of stuff, a space for him to compose articles and reports himself on some of the latest methods in use so he could endorse or debunk them, and a space for others who suffered from speech difficulties to share their experiences of treatments and exercises they had tried. The fact of this periodical's origin in the editor's deep interest in speech pathology and its extension of that concern to voice culture in general underscores the figure of voice in this period as that of a pure signal without disruption. David Applebaum's philosophical study, Voice, is useful to bring in here because it considers the implications of disruptors of vocal fluidity in speech. He has chapters on the cough, the laugh, babble, breath. And as Applebaum states, the reading voice, speech, frames voice the way that a glove fits the hand. That is, the voice is meant to fit its signal like a glove. Elocution, as theorized and studied for practice in the periodicals we are discussing, mobilized articulation to align its contours perfectly with those of the interpreted text. In this context, stammering and oratory and all modes of expressive vocal practice that aspire to align voice and signal are of a piece. Survey of the mastheads of the voice indicates that a range of terms, theories, and practices that fell within the continuum of methods for vocal alignment. It shows us that. Some of these key terms being voice culture, musical and elocutionary, oratory, Delsart's philosophy, voice building, singing, visible speech, the Smellville Bell, vocal and physical expression, expression as a fine art, etc. And the often lengthy subtitles also covered who the journal served, including those preparing for public careers, teachers, preachers, lawyers, singers, lecturers, elocutionists, orators, and actors. It was a commercial journal, but it also served at different points in its existence as the official organ, but not the journal, of the National Association of Elocutionists, the Music Teachers National Association, and numerous cognate state-level elocution associations for which it published conference proceedings alongside an array of other articles. And I think it's important to note that while Werner's was the official publication organ for the first national speech associations in America and a range of related regional associations, it was never controlled or funded by their organizers. It was never the instrument of a particular school of elocution. And while it may be understood as, quote, a forerunner of professional speech journals that were to come, that's Merritt's argument, it was not a professional or association journal itself. This is interesting because it positioned Werner's as a platform that was happy to support the work of these associations while it continued to publish the work of unaffiliated speech scholars and practitioners. It served multiple communities at once and published the work of rival theorists and schools of elocution within the same issue. So you did get some spicy stuff between Curry and Stebbins happening in Werner's. As a running anthology of articles about cures for speech defects, the practice of literary recitation, and the history and proceedings of the Professional Association of Elocutionists in numerous genres. These are some of the genres that you could find there: biographical sketches, critical reviews of performers and book reviews, papers presented at conferences and reports on conventions, rejoinders to criticism, editorials, letters and replies to letters, and other miscellaneous forms. Werner's documented the extensive field of training concerned with the transformation of speech into voice at the end of the 19th century. And that's not all. For most of the 1890s, the journal also offered an average of around 15 recitation pieces per month, thus functioning as a reader on top of everything else. The selections, primarily for solo readers, consisted of works mostly by published American authors of the day, many of them women, and some by well-known British writers like Kipling, Tennyson, Dickens. They ran alongside articles concerned with how the quality of literature informed the standards of voice culture and about the discrimination of the better material from those that are mere entertainment. So with this point about critical discrimination as it relates to elocutionary practice in mind, I will close my talk with a look at the elocutionist Solomon Henry S.H. Clark as one of many contributors to Werner's, who was attempting to establish institutional credibility for elocution by articulating what the figure of voice should sound like, how it might be realized through the process of learning to read literature well. Clark, you may recall, was professor of oratory at the University of Chicago. I would place him alongside Curry, Corson, and Ayres as those who were most engaged in the attempt to extend ideas of reading aloud into advanced forms of literary study and education at the end of the 19th century, through books like these and through essays and excerpts published in Werner's and other periodicals. The February 1897 issue of Werner's, an issue that included a reprint of J. Mount Blair's essay, Living Autograms, which was originally published in the Phonoscope, and which I only knew from that one, so I was surprised to find it again in Werner's, that imagines a library of unique voice autographs, and an essay by Melville Bell on phonetic syllabication, a cure for speech defects, which aims to promote the crisp articulation of syllables in speaking. Saw a reprint of Clark's Chautauqua lecture, The New Elocution. So that's the title, The New Elocution. His lecture, he's at a Chautauqua gathering, and this is a reprint of that. Here, Clark asserts that the elocution has become a byword for all that is bad, affected, stilted, bombastic in reading. The figure of voice produced by the old elocution is on the outs with the goals of higher education. He says, our universities detest it. They detest the old elocution's separation of the voice from the man. So in this lecture, Clark goes on to illustrate what he means by this distinction between the old and the new elocution. And I wish I had known this when I was writing Phonopoetics, but I only discovered it like a month ago, by delivering two readings of Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, one after the other. The first reading, he warns before he starts, will be nothing more than a vocal and gestural display. In the space where the first reading would have been delivered, in this transcript of it, we read this description in an editor-observer's voice, provided in square brackets. It says, Mr. Clark then read the selection, giving a decided impression of a stirring battle scene, with its storm of shot and shell, its melee of sword and saber, of wounded and dying men, in fact, a picturesque representation of the fearful charge. Following this old elocutionary performance, Clark proceeds to attempt the new way. Before I can do so, he says, let me see if I cannot enter into the poet's heart and mind and see out of what mental and emotional conditions this poem sprang. He rehearses an account of those conditions in a full column of text. He basically gives a reading of the poem, essentially, is what he does there. And then the voice in brackets returns to tell us, quote, the speaker then read the poem with this idea in mind. The rest of the lecture continues to distinguish between old and new elocution, and perhaps the most important distinction makes is that between entrainment and education. The old elocution entrains, the new elocution educates. The pugilist entrains, the bullfighter entrains, but one would hardly claim for the disciples of these arts the title of educators. What does the new elocution claim to be? First, not merely an accomplishment. Second, truly educative. It aims to develop self-expression. It aims to make its students ministers of literature, extempore speakers, public orators, and I repeat, lastly, and only incidentally, does it aim to make them entrainers. Einstein uses the term entrainment in the race of sound to explain our naturalized expectations, our ingrained biases that work to reinforce a constellation of beliefs in the possibility of a stable, knowable sound. Clark's distinction between the practical drilling of entrainers and the expansive teaching of educators seems to promise a way out of the biases of Einstein's idea of entrainment through the proper study of literature. Clarke continued to advocate for elocution as a new method of literary education in future issues of Werner's, most notably in his essay, Reading Aloud as an Aid to Literary Study, published in March 1900, where he tries to explain how reading aloud can be, quote, made to contribute to the acquisition of the thought and spirit of literature. Some of the technical elements of reading aloud as literary study that Clarke outlines could function as familiar imperatives to use in the teaching of reading from elementary school through university. Things like, and these are sort of like little fragment quotes from his list of things you have to do. Pay attention to details. Move through the text slowly. Concentrate. Pay attention. Attention is a really important concept, attending. Other parts of the techne are less obviously instrumental, like determine the emotional instinct of the poetic line. Enter the spirit of the author. Experience emotions you will never know yourself. Open your ethical and aesthetic faculties. The mode of reading and of listening promoted in such arguments for literary study imagine voice as the figure of an authentically embodied hermeneutics that it was supposed a teacher would recognize if he heard it. It was the voice of an individual in the process of living, embodying, being mentally and physically possessed by, in entrainment, in sync with the spirit of a literary work. While not quite the automated postural process of instantaneously tapping into the magnetism of a text as one might align with the magnetic forces floating in the ether, and that's a mode of elocution that Shaftesbury magazine editor Webster Edgerly promoted. There's still a whiff of exclusionary magic at work in this formulation of literary interpretation and the figure of the voice of literature it summons. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
A good deal of time for questions. So there are going to be microphones speeding to you. If you will only raise your hand. So, question.
Thank you very much, Jason. This is a very small, very practical question. It's about this slide you showed about the school of expression. It looked like the girl on the side of the picture had something on her head, and I wondered if it was one. Yeah, no, you just passed it. The school of expression, not this one. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
What she got on the head is
yeah
one of these apparatuses for magnetism or something.
Yeah. I was looking at that image and I don't really know. I can't identify specifically what that dress would have referred to. There were less in expression, much more in Werner's, quite a lot of articles on dressing for elocutionary performance, dressing for the platform. But I can't say that that particular image relates to those concerns, or it was just some kind of stock image they happen to have around, which is also very possible, because expression didn't have a lot of illustrations normally, so I'm not sure what their capacities were in that, but yeah, but it may have actual significance, or it may not. Maybe someone else knows or has thoughts on it. Did you have an answer to the question, or just another question?
Okay, I'm just curious about to what degree, if any, this idea of the new elocution in which you attempt to feel the feelings of the author of the poem, does that overlap with like theater? Do they refer to it as acting? Because it sounds very much like at least some styles of like method acting. You attempt to embody what you are feeling as a character, and I'm just really curious whether it's considered theatrical or primarily literary.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you see across all these different journals and competing schools, right, are, as I was in one sense, what I was suggesting is sort of vying for ascendancy as a particular elocutionary method, but also in relation to the formation through institutions and departments of particular disciplinary forms that will take hold and that universities will, go with or not, right? And we're kind of witnessing a moment where there are different theories and philosophies, but there's not necessarily a landing place within a kind of stable disciplinary foothold within institutions of higher education that those things will land in, right? And so, so a lot of this stuff gets knocked out of English studies, like it doesn't make its way into English studies. I think what I've been focusing on some of those elocutionists who are most invested in this as an actual form of critical interpretation, right? In ways that we think of, you have a student interpret a poem and they produce an essay on it, that they'd be doing all of that work, but then they would be manifesting that work in their oral delivery of it, right? Now, so some of those, those methods, which were known as expressionist school or naturalist school, were different from a whole slew of. It's not as though there were only two schools. There were all, like I said, there are all these different schools, and the Stebbins, Delsartean, sort of pantomime gesture oriented schools also had footholds and things like that, and some of them made their way into theater departments. A lot of them evolved first as schools of speech, public speaking, and then rhetoric and writing, and then eventually into liberal arts colleges if they landed in places. So that's what Emerson College and Curry College, and other examples like that. Departments even, we heard from Fiona when she gave a talk earlier this week, at Northwestern, there were departments that sort of took them in, but then they became part of theater, whatever. So in a way, the question is sort of what legitimate disciplines evolved where some of these philosophies could take hold, right? A lot of departments of speech developed into departments of communication studies afterwards. Like, so they evolved from a disciplinary perspective differently. But it's as though we're getting like all these theories flailing, to find their footing, right? And so, yeah, so sometimes theater departments, sometimes whether one could trace a genealogy from Curry's particular theories of dramatic instinct to method acting, I think it's quite possible, actually, because these texts were still circulating and being read and being used in a variety of contexts, not just sort of oratorical platforms or public readings or things like that. Expression as a journal focused a lot less on the diversity of modes of public speaking or of performing with speech in public than Werner's did. And Werner's had, departments that were on theatricals, departments that were on pantomime, departments that were on, so on all these different ways of performing. So, but it's sort of like the departments of the journals were evoking possible institutionalized departments, but not all of them kind of took hold. Like, yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
And thank you for the really wonderful talk. One of the ways current cognitive scientists talk about entrainment is the cocktail party theory, in which your brain matches sounds to the person in a noisy room that you wish to be able to hear, even though there's a lot of distracting sounds. So I was really interested in the elocutionist who was talking about like entrainment's not enough. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Because modern entrainment theory is all about attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wondered if you could go into a little bit more there about the like sense that you have to expose something real through your performance. that to give other people something to do more than to entrain to, versus like this modern sense that like if you even just entrain, that's a minor miracle. But like what is the like the movement between a great performer and the person trying to then do the next level of more than training, if that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the discussions and the contested debates that are happening. I think by the time we get to the 1880s, there's certain films. Is it Singing in the Rain, right? Like you can think of Singing in the Rain and certain modes of acting, right, that work well within one frame, suddenly seem completely out of place and unnatural in another. So it's one way to quickly sort of think about that, right? I think that the Stebbins-Delsarte sort of school, right, found its footing again. So when it moved away from acting out particular narratives, right, that were still associated with elocution, but actually moved into dance, right, and it was a major influence on modern dance, right. So that's sort of where Delsartism went, right. Isadora Duncan and Stebbins herself also moved into dance, right. Sort of gave it a more like sort of a more palatable or legitimate, authentic venue of expression than one that would be associated with, oral communication and those kinds of gestures. More prescriptive elocutionary models really were kind of being eliminated by the end of the 19th century. And then when we look at like Curry, Corson, some of those figures, I see them as sort of proto literary critics, right? When I didn't show, the slide, whoops, at the end here, I didn't show Corson, that basically the voice is the organ of the soul. What does that mean, right? But then when we get to I.A. Richards, he's still thinking about how to authentically communicate a reading of a poem, right? And he has a pretty long debate with himself about the relative merits of reading aloud in practical criticism in the chapter on form at the end. And even to the very last footnote, he doesn't eliminate it as being potentially valuable, right? But the reason he thinks public readings are dangerous, ultimately, is because it's too likely that someone will be exposed to a bad reading and it will close off the possibility of them immersing themselves into the poem as they would need to or want to. So it actually gets in the way of that kind of immersive process that people like Curry, was talking about. But he does feel, it's really interesting. I mean, I'm still trying to unpack this, this last footnote, partly because, so he says, though private reading aloud is much to be recommended as an aid in the working out the form of a poem, it's doubtful whether public readings in the classroom, for example, which we probably all do, right? If you teach poetry, you'll read it, right? Should be encouraged. Nothing more easily defeats the whole aim of poetry than to hear it incompetently mouthed, or to struggle oneself to read out a poem in public before it has given up most of its secrets, right? But he says private reading aloud, so we could do it on our own, like to immerse ourselves in this as part of this reading process, interpretive process, is recommended partly because movements of the organs of speech with muscular and tactile images of them enter into the ascribed sound of words almost as much as auditory sensations and images themselves. So he seems to be, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what he's saying here, right? But, ascribes sound. And so into the ascribed sound words, it's as though part of sound, it seems to me to go back to that figure of speech that Nina Eidsheim's talking about, where, the very movements of the vocal apparatus, right, is part of our ascription. It belongs to, the sound and the meaning that comes from it afterwards. So even as we move into like what's supposed to be the disembodiment of voice, ultimately in the new criticism, where voice becomes a metaphor that we use to give coherent structure to a poem, for example, we talk about the voice in the poem, but we're not really talking about the reading voice any longer, right? Richard's even still in that is keeping that actual, physiological sort of manifestation of voice alive. I've totally forgotten the original question that you asked. Oh yeah, you were talking about the neurological. Yeah. So I think there are other places in these journals where also, because conversation is one of the departments, right? So there are actual other forms of speech, right? So I'm focusing on the literary and reading, right? But reading's probably not the best example to be thinking about that cognitive model that you're speaking of, although I think you can, but there are whole departments in Berners, for example, on conversation that I think would be more relevant for thinking about attention, to the dynamics that one is engaging with, and sort of getting in tune and aligning oneself with another. So there are probably other sections of these massive sort of magazines that I haven't looked at that would be fruitful for pursuing that question. And I did, as I was trying to dig up every possible definition of entrainment, and I was working on this, and so I did even get to the point of watching like TED Talks on cognitive body mapping, like through social encounters and stuff like that, which I found very interesting, but didn't really bring in here too much. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that fascinating paper. During this time period, of course, was a lot of innovation in sound recording. Is there any reference to that in these journals as like a competing realm of performance, or as educational technology? It just seems like they would intersect in some way, this realm.
Yeah, for sure. I mentioned briefly the J. Mount Blair for essay Living Autograms. That has like a full page, print of Edison's phonograph. Edison, in his earliest essays on the phonograph, one of the top 5 things that he said it would be used for was for the improvement of speech and elocution, right? So that was picked up and sort of thought about. And in this period though, like we're 1870s, like the workable phonograph, the perfected phonograph was only released in 1888, and really only functionally marketed and used by any number of people into the 1890s. So it's pretty late, right? I can say that as we move on into the acoustic era of sound recording, there were whole education departments that developed by some of the early record companies that thought about using phonographic recordings for the teaching of literature and for the teaching of speech and language. Shaw famously, made a recording, Spoken English and Broken English, which was actually part of the Linguaphone series for ESL, essentially. So there's talk about it, but it's still mostly notional until you get to sort of the end of the 19th century. And it doesn't really take hold until even later than that, especially with flat disc recordings. And mostly once you hit the electronic recording, so after 1827, some of the earliest educational recordings for the teaching of literature were made although there were a lot of like recitation recordings and elocution recordings that were sort of notionally part of education departments of record companies, but it was really I'm trying to remember the name of the association, but it's an association to the teaching of English that used these recordings that were made at Barnard College by William Cabell Greet in his speech lab, where he was collecting dialects. Essentially, he was a linguist, and he was analyzing American dialect, but he brought in some poets, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, a couple of well-known poets, Gertrude Stein, and then they released them as for use in educational recording. Then the Library of Congress re-released those recordings as well. And so, so there was some discussion of that, but the better answer to that question is that throughout Berners, throughout even most of the journals, there was discussion of all of the tools for measuring voice, for visualizing voice. So Melville Bell's visible speech was very important, you know, as one of them, but also the laryngoscope. There were all kinds of images of cross sections of the head, so that you could look into the throat and the tongue and the palate and you know, and stuff like that. So there was a lot of interest, obviously, in the physical mechanics of voice. And if I can sort of pull up, I have some of these, but of the phonograph itself, there was like, you know, it was all quite hypothetical. Yeah, this is a kind of weird example, but that it's kind of that this is the detail, this one here, but it's a short little article at the bottom of a page introducing a mode of mechanical speech that was invented for someone who had throat cancer, and they had to make a second incision, one so he could breathe, and another to which he could articulate from. And those those bags there, if you can see them, were to push air through his throat as he wanted to articulate something. So there were all kinds of articles sort of about these new inventions related to the vocal apparatus. So not just sort of recording through the phonograph, but there was a real interest in measurement, sort of really trying to make the entire endeavor scientific and, you know, authorized in different ways.
Oh, well, I had a kind of a broad question, and I apologize in advance for being kind of crude. But it comes out of my own interest in how ordinary people actually spoke in the 19th century. And so, looking at all this prescriptivist work, I'm wondering what, if anything, a close study of these kinds of periodicals can tell us about how ordinary people in, say, late 19th century actually spoke when they were called upon to speak in public. For example, I mean, were there certain common habits of speech that, despite the efforts of all these elocutionists, were proved to be just ineradicable? But the complaints about them tell us something worth knowing about ways in which people spoke that that perhaps didn't survive into the 20th century or survived in some people. So if you could address that just sort of as the role of this as historical evidence on how to handle it in answering those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first way to approach that question is like, what do you mean by historical evidence, right? I could say we do have sound recordings. What I mean is the actual voice, you know, it sort of comes back to my question of the figure of voice. As soon as it sounded, it's becoming this sort of object of interpretation, right? We have some recordings of some of the people who are actually publishing in these journals. And so we can get little samples of what they spoke like, and what certain schools may have been aiming at in their methods of reading or performance. William Jennings Bryant did recordings. There are, like, you know, ones who are quite, I guess, paradigmatic, you know, speakers of the time. And then, as I mentioned, there were people who are actually collecting sort of regional dialects from across the country. So there are actual recording libraries, you know, that document modes of speech in different regions and things like that. So that's one form of evidence that mostly linguists seem to use, you know, for their approaches. It's interesting thinking about, well, you know, it doesn't mean that we couldn't use that, you know, to think about these kinds of performances, right? But it's partly the way approaches to speech and language have been divided up by discipline. It's sort of the territory of the linguist to be thinking about those recordings as evidence of something, right? I, as someone who just likes to read around, but not necessarily define, you know, finally what someone would have sounded like, because I think the answer will usually be quite disappointing and banal, right? I find, like, in many ways, the more interesting stuff is in the speaking around the signal, rather than having the signal to sort of define exactly, well, what did someone sound like, you know? That's just maybe my bias in terms of approaching these materials, you know? It's also partly from having been engaged in a project these last 8 years of digitizing large collections of audio recordings documenting literary readings that took place since the 1950s. So there, and sometimes it's really exciting to find a poet you love reading their work, and it's very interesting. And sometimes you wish hadn't had it, and you wish you'd sort of just imagined it or, read about it or something like that. But I suppose my focus so far in this work has been on the discourses surrounding, the aspirations around these figures of voice rather than trying to get that actual evidence through a recording. And then I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Patrick.
Yeah, you sort of are.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I guess another way of putting it would be, for example, is the discourse about what's wrong with the way ordinary people speak in public. Tell us anything about the way ordinary people spoke in public.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I haven't even approached that question, to be honest. It frankly wasn't a big interest of mine.
Online from Fiona Maxwell.
Oh, thanks. Great.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much for this fantastic talk. It really these periodicals just paint such an evocative picture of the world of elocution as a discipline, as a practice. So thank you for sharing these sources. Can everyone hear me? Just checking.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Thank you. So my question is, do you have a sense of the readership for these periodicals? So they come from different kind of publishing sites, from schools to individuals, and they seem to have different purposes kind of scripted into them. But do you have a sense of, was it primarily, professors, theorists, educators, performers? Was it also students, younger people, home studiers, correspondence students? And also within these readers and contributors, have you been able to kind of identify any patterns in terms of things like gender breakdown, thinking about how scholars have tracked like the feminization of elocution at this time? As someone who currently is at the University of Chicago here, learning about Solomon Henry Clark was so interesting. His critique of the field reminded me a little bit of what I've read about how elocution increasingly gets criticized as being melodramatic or bad, kind of at the moment that women kind of take over the field. So, yeah, any thoughts about that? And my final kind of part of this question is, Chicago, as you mentioned, is so highly represented in these periodicals. Do you have a sense of why that is? So
Why
thank
that
you.
is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for those great questions. I think to the first question about readership, so I've just, like I said, have been churning through a lot of material. And I think to answer that question well and properly, one would need to do sort of what you've been doing, which is immerse yourself in some of the archives, especially out of the institutions, or that if there are institutional archives surrounding those periodicals. And I haven't done that for any of them. Right now, I'm kind of narrowing down which ones I want to kind of focus on. I should say, this is part of a book project that's actually about, it's called sort of literary listening. So it's sort of thinking, one of the main questions is, has literary study, not ambitious at all, since the 18th century, has literary study had audile techniques or approaches or methods of listening as an integral part of studying literature, right? So that's sort of one of the starting questions for this project. And so I've been looking at these journals, sort of thinking about which ones would be really interesting and useful for thinking about that question. And I think the answer to that question might be, interestingly, sort of found in information about how the teaching actually happened. So like you were talking about in your talk the other day, how many reviews of readings were being published in some of the journals that you were looking at, right? And there were a lot of them also in these journals. And that's one source of kind of listening, to these and critiquing them. But I also think in some of the pedagogical materials that might be available in the archives related to these periodicals, I could find more answers to those, and also more answers to the breakdowns of the actual readerships, For expression, so I think expression will be one that I'm probably going to focus on. And for expression, it really does seem, although he was Curry, and he founded that school with his wife, and they both were teaching there, and they were really trying to reach out and develop essentially enrollments, for their school. So that was one real motivation for this, because they believed in what they were doing. He taught at Boston University prior, which is where he was educated, and then sort of was sort of spun off, and developed his own school. My sense from reading the journal is that it was very much aimed at both men and women. Expression was, but maybe. And Werner's has, I think you're quite right. As you move into from the voice from the 70s into the 80s and then into the 90s, and I've done that kind of very, you're looking through, you're seeing what's interesting, but not reading every word. That the representation of women as you move on in time to the end of the 19th century increases substantially, and by the end. Werner published Stebbens's Delsarte method of expression, among other books, and there were in its very last years, it became very sort of Stebbins pantomime, costume, dress, and then almost furnishings. It became something closer to what I would recognize as a women's journal, in this last year. So I think, and it's just from having looked at it quite quickly so far, but I think that there's definitely something there in terms of thinking about this sort of the changing audience of Werner's. As I tried to cover sort of the changing audiences over the different periods of that journal, because it kept changing its mastheads and reimagining itself. And I do think that you can almost look at it, within slots of periods to answer that question properly. But I do think you'd probably need to do it with each journal individually, to sort of think about it. Yeah, sorry, that would be my take. And yeah, I was trying to find you yesterday because I'm really interested in coming to look at some of the archives here in Chicago. So I'll be in touch with you about that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating material. I think that my question a little overlaps some of what you've answered, but not entirely. I wanted to know who attended these institutions. And I'm thinking of the fact that, of course, in the 19th century, most people would not have attended university. So I noticed the Bible. Are they preparing to be preachers? Are they preparing to be school teachers? But most important, what's the relationship between these academies and other institutions? I'm thinking these are not people who are going to the university. They're coming to these. Are these something like European gymnasium? Are they junior colleges? Are they something like normal schools, which would be a standard thing for a 19th century person to go to for a year or two? And what kinds of occupations then do they have after they do this? And then I was thinking of the geography of this. Are there certain places in the country where this type of thing is more picked up? Because you gave the example, of course, the Middle West, upper Middle West, but also of the East Coast. So, and then you mentioned women. I noticed there are quite a few women who are writing articles for these journals.
Mm-hmm.
So it does seem to be a kind of a woman's field, like for future school teachers. I'm just wondering where, in terms of occupational demographics, these institutions fitted in.
Yeah, I think it's again a great question. I think so far it seemed to me from the journals I've been looking at that Boston, New York, Chicago were hotspots, but I believe, there were certainly elocution associations popping up in different regions of the country. As far as, an initial tentative answer to who was going and what was their function for placement, as we would call it now afterwards, right? That it does seem like that it was open. It was an opening for women to get an education of some kind, right? But a lot of, like, my sense that Emerson and Curry School in particular, and I haven't looked into this, right? What kinds of accreditation did they have, right? And what kinds were they aspiring to get as they went on? Because eventually they became just sort of regular colleges, right? So this is all, I mean, these are all questions I have, right, as well right now. So you just listed a set of amazing questions that I need to find the answers to, you know. And I do think it requires that kind of archival research. That institutional archives are often, you know, such a treasure trove of information about things that we don't always go to, you know. And I think for this set of periodicals, I'm hoping, you know, that that will be where I'll find answers to some of those questions, assuming that Curry College has kept some of its records well, etc., which isn't always the case.